Oyster street food. Oysters were never always a delicacy. For much of the 19th century, they were the fast food of the urban poor. In cities like New York and London, oysters were astonishingly abundant. Vendors sold them from wooden stalls on nearly every street corner, often for just a few pennies a dozen. To the working class, they provided a cheap, readily available source of protein far more affordable than beef, pork, or chicken. Oysters were not a treat, they were sustenance. Families and laborers relied on them daily, using them to bulk up meat pies or simply to fill stomachs when other food was scarce. Their role in the diet of the urban poor was as essential as bread. The scale of consumption was extraordinary. In New York City, discarded oyster shells were piled in vast heaps, later repurposed to pave streets, fill in shorelines, and reshape the city's geography. The shells, a byproduct of everyday meals, became infrastructure. People ate oysters as a matter of routine. Dock workers after long shifts, factory laborers between jobs, newsboys with pockets full of coins. Oyster cellars were crowded, noisy, and often unsanitary. Patrons did not dine in quiet contemplation. They ate quickly, standing or sitting on benches, consuming plate after plate to satisfy hunger rather than indulgence. In London, the scene was similar. Street vendors and cellar houses offered oysters in enormous quantities to a population that depended on them for cheap nutrition. The taste was briny, the preparation minimal, and the experience communal and rough around the edges. There was no association with ceremony or refinement. Oysters were a food of practicality, not luxury. This era of abundance could not last. Industrialization brought pollution. Factories discharged waste into rivers and bays, contaminating waters where oysters thrived. At the same time, overharvesting began to strip beds bare. By the late 19th century, oysters were no longer the cheap staple they had once been. Their collapse created scarcity, and scarcity transformed perception. What was once considered mundane and plentiful became rare and coveted. Oysters slowly moved from the tables of laborers to those of the wealthy. Chefs refined presentation, serving them on the half-shell with lemon, sauces, and ritualized service. The very abundance that had defined their lowly status was replaced by exclusivity. Today, oysters are an expensive indulgence, often associated with fine dining, celebrations, and status symbols. Few remember that these same mollusks once fed the masses for pennies a dozen, or that their discarded shells paved streets and reshaped the urban landscape. Oysters' journey from street food to luxury illustrates how scarcity, geography, and changing tastes can invert the social meaning of a food. What was once everyday sustenance is now an icon of indulgence, a transformation that obscures the humble origins of a food that was once the working class's staple protein. Fermented sushi. Sushi did not begin as cuisine. It began as a solution to rot. Long before it appeared under soft lighting on polished wooden counters, sushi existed as a crude preservation method used by people with no access to ice, salt stores, or wealth. In ancient Japan, fish spoiled quickly. Coastal villages depended on rivers and seasonal catches, but without refrigeration, protein was fleeting. The answer was fermentation. Fish were packed tightly into cooked rice and sealed away for months. As the rice fermented, it produced lactic acid, slowing bacterial growth and keeping the fish edible far beyond its natural lifespan. The rice itself was never the goal. It became sour, pungent, and unpalatable. When the process was complete, the rice was scraped off and thrown away. Only the preserved fish was eaten, typically by farmers, fishermen, and laborers who needed calories, not refinement. This early form, known today as narazushi, was not served fresh. It smelled strong, tasted sharp, and bore little resemblance to modern sushi. It was survival food. There were no chefs, no knives shaped like surgical instruments, no emphasis on balance or beauty. It was prepared in bulk, stored in barrels, and eaten out of necessity. For centuries, this was sushi's identity. It belonged to rural households and working people, not to temples or elite courts. That perception did not change quickly. Even as Japan entered the Edo period, sushi remained associated with practicality rather than prestige. But something subtle shifted in the growing city of Edo, now Tokyo. Urban life demanded speed. Workers needed meals that could be eaten quickly and cheaply without cooking. Vendors began selling a new version of sushi that abandoned long fermentation altogether. Fresh fish from Edo Bay was sliced and placed on small mounds of rice seasoned with vinegar. The vinegar replicated the sourness of fermentation without the months-long wait. This was nigiri sushi, and it was sold from street stalls to dockworkers, merchants, and travelers. It was eaten with the hands, often standing. It was greasy by elite standards, informal, and considered inappropriate for high society. At the time, this was fast food. Contemporary accounts describe sushi stalls as noisy, crowded, and distinctly working class. The portions were large, the flavors aggressive, and the fish often marinated or cured to mask freshness issues. No aristocrat would have built a reputation around eating it in public. Sushi was filling, cheap, and disposable. Exactly what it was meant to be. The transformation began much later and largely outside Japan. After World War II, advances in refrigeration and transportation changed how fish could be stored and shipped. Raw seafood, once risky and regional, became globally accessible. As Japanese cuisine spread internationally, sushi was reframed. Portion sizes shrank. Presentation became central. The rice, once discarded, became a focal point, seasoned precisely and shaped deliberately. Fish selection narrowed to species prized for texture and fat content. Scarcity replaced abundance. Today, sushi exists at the opposite end of the economic spectrum from where it began. High-end omakase menus emphasize exclusivity, seasonality, and mastery. A single piece can cost more than an entire day's worth of street sushi once did. What was invented to keep fish from spoiling is now celebrated as purity. What fed laborers is now consumed as status. Sushi did not change because it became better. It changed because the world around it did. Bluefin Reversal. For most of its history, bluefin tuna was not a prize. It was a problem. The fish was large, powerful, and difficult to handle, but none of that translated into value. In early 20th century Japan, bluefin tuna, known as maguro, occupied the lowest rung of the seafood hierarchy. Fishermen caught it regularly, yet markets showed little interest. The reason was not scarcity or danger, but fat. Bluefin tuna contains an unusually high fat content, especially in its belly. In an era before modern refrigeration, that fat turned against it. The meat spoiled quickly in warm air, developing off odors and textures that made it undesirable for sale or storage. As a result, bluefin tuna was often discarded. Historical records and first-hand accounts describe fishermen burying the fish in fields to use as fertilizer. Others sold it for animal feed or processed it into cat food. It was not unusual for docks to reject entire catches. The fish was too oily, too dark, and too unstable to be trusted. What could not be buried or thrown away was typically soaked in strong marinades to mask flavor and extend shelf life. This was not a mark of respect. It was damage control. The most telling detail lies in the part now considered most valuable. Toro, the fatty belly meat of bluefin tuna, was once actively avoided. At the time, culinary ideals favored lean protein. Fat was associated with spoilage, heaviness, and lack of refinement. The buttery texture that defines toro today was interpreted as greasy and excessive. Even its appearance worked against it. The deep red color of bluefin meat was described as bloody and crude when compared to the pale flesh of fish considered elegant and clean. For decades, bluefin tuna existed on the margins of cuisine. It was a working fisherman's burden, not a merchant's treasure. Its value came not from taste, but from whatever secondary use could be extracted after markets refused it. There was no mystique, no ceremony, no hierarchy of cuts. It was simply an inconvenient fish. The reversal began quietly in the second half of the 20th century. By the 1970s, global diets were changing. In many countries, fattier foods such as beef and dairy had become normalized and even desirable. At the same time, International air travel and flash freezing technology made it possible to transport fish across continents without immediate spoilage. The very characteristic that once made bluefin worthless became manageable. As taste shifted, chefs began to reassess the fish. The fat that had once been seen as a flaw was reinterpreted as richness. Texture replaced leanness as a marker of quality. Toro, once buried or discarded, emerged as the most coveted portion. Its scarcity, intensified by overfishing and regulation, added to its mystique. Auctions turned fish into symbols. Prices climbed into the hundreds of thousands, then the millions. Nothing about the fish itself changed. Its biology remained the same. What changed was technology, transportation, and perception. Bluefin tuna did not become better. The world simply learned how to accommodate it, and then decided it wanted what it had always thrown away. The most expensive bite in the seafood world was once considered barely fit to eat. Polenta Survival. Polenta was never meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to keep people alive. Long before it appeared beneath braised meats or shaved truffles, polenta was a last resort. Its story begins not in fine kitchens, but in the fields of northern Italy, where soil was poor, winters were harsh, and social mobility was almost non-existent. When corn arrived from the Americas in the 16th century, it spread quickly across these regions. It was cheap, resilient, and could grow where wheat often failed. For landowners, it was a useful crop. For peasants, it became something far more dangerous. It became almost everything they ate. Polenta, made by boiling ground cornmeal into a thick porridge, required little fuel, little skill, and no costly ingredients. Meat was rare. Wheat flour was expensive. Vegetables were seasonal and unreliable. Corn, by contrast, was abundant. Over time, entire rural communities began subsisting almost entirely on polenta, sometimes eating it for every meal, day after day, year after year. This was not culinary tradition. It was economic confinement. The consequences were severe. Corn contains niacin, a vital nutrient, but in a form the human body cannot absorb unless the grain is treated with lime, a process known as nixtamalization. Indigenous cultures in the Americas had long understood this. Northern Italian peasants did not. As a result, widespread nutritional deficiency took hold. The disease that followed was pellagra, and it became synonymous with poverty. Its symptoms were unmistakable: inflamed skin, open sores, chronic diarrhea, confusion, and eventually dementia. In its advanced stages, it was fatal. Pellagra was so prevalent that it earned a grim reputation as a peasant disease. Doctors, landowners, and officials observed its spread, yet the social structure that caused it remained intact. Polenta was not blamed as a system. It was treated as a fact of life. The dish became a marker of class. To eat polenta daily was to signal desperation. It was filling, bland, and nutritionally incomplete. No one romanticized it. No one celebrated it. For centuries, polenta represented stagnation. It was the food of people who could not leave, could not diversify their diets, and could not afford alternatives. Even as Italy modernized, the association lingered. To serve polenta was to evoke hardship. To rely on it was to admit scarcity. Its rehabilitation came much later and from above, not below. In the 20th century, chefs began revisiting regional Italian foods through a different lens. Polenta was no longer evaluated as a sole source of sustenance, but as a base. Butter was added. Cream softened the texture. Aged cheeses enriched the flavor. Cooking times lengthened, transforming the grain into something smooth and controlled rather than dense and coarse. What had once been monotonous became customizable. Eventually, polenta was reframed as rustic authenticity. Its history was stripped of disease and desperation. In modern restaurants, it appears as comfort food, carefully plated and deliberately indulgent. The same cornmeal that once caused mass malnutrition is now paired with luxury ingredients and sold as heritage cuisine. Nothing about polenta's origins was elegant. It sustained people who had no other option, and it harmed them in the process. Its transformation did not erase that history. It simply made it easier to forget that what is now celebrated was once endured. Escargot Origins. Escargot was not always a delicacy. For centuries, it was survival. Long before the gleaming copper pans of Parisian kitchens or the meticulous plating of haute cuisine, snails were a humble, even despised, source of food. Across the French countryside, livestock was scarce, especially for peasants who labored from dawn to dusk on rented plots of poor soil. Pigs, chickens, and cows required land, feed, and care that many could not afford. Snails, by contrast, were abundant. They crawled freely among vineyards, gardens, and fields, requiring nothing from their human harvesters beyond patience and a little knowledge of when to collect them. In rural communities, these creatures became known as the poor man's oysters, not for any elegance, but for their texture and the meager sustenance they provided. During the Middle Ages, snails played a functional role in religious practice as well as survival. Lent imposed strict prohibitions on meat, but snails were not classified as animal flesh by the church. Peasants, hungry and resource-limited, turned to snails as a cheap source of protein that allowed them to adhere to spiritual law while avoiding starvation. The preparation was simple. Snails were boiled, often in water with whatever wild herbs could be gathered nearby. There were no recipes, no flavor balancing, no presentation to impress. The goal was survival. The taste was muddy, the texture slimy, and the act of gathering them meant crawling through dirt and underbrush, sometimes carrying only a small basket. Escargot remained firmly associated with poverty for centuries. It was practical, not pleasurable. Its consumption carried no social prestige, no culinary artistry. Families relied on it because there were no alternatives. Children grew up with snails, tasting them out of necessity rather than curiosity. It was a food of the earth, raw in every sense, a reminder that sustenance was a matter of resourcefulness rather than choice. The transformation began in the early 19th century with one of the most influential chefs of his era, Marie-Antoine Carême. Serving the visiting Tsar Alexander I, Carême sought to elevate the humble snail into a centerpiece of refined dining. The process involved stuffing the shells with butter, garlic, and parsley, a combination that masked the earthiness of the snail while highlighting richness and flavor. By doing so, he turned a gritty survival food into a vehicle for culinary art. The muddy, utilitarian taste of the peasant dish was replaced with carefully composed flavors that appealed to elite palates. The rebranding was remarkably successful. Snails, once a food collected from dirt paths and vineyard edges, became a symbol of refinement and technique. French menus listed them with reverence. Specialized tools, the tongs and small forks used to extract the meat from its shell, added ceremony and distance from the humble origins of the dish. What had been eaten out of necessity was now consumed for pleasure, prestige, and indulgence. Escargot's journey from survival food to luxury illustrates the transformation of perception and preparation. The creatures that once sustained the rural poor were now showcased in gilded restaurants, accompanied by wine and applause, far removed from the mud and herbs of their origin. A food once linked to poverty and practicality had, in the hands of chefs and history, become a marker of sophistication. Quinoa suppression. Quinoa was never meant for luxury. It was a seed of survival. Long before it appeared in smoothie bowls or Instagram-ready salad bowls, quinoa was the lifeblood of the Andean highlands. For centuries, the grain sustained the Incan Empire, forming the backbone of diets in regions where wheat could not grow. It was revered, not merely for nourishment, but as a sacred crop, woven into ritual, religion, and daily life. Entire harvests were dedicated to ceremonies, and every village depended on its resilience to feed families through harsh winters and unforgiving mountain terrain. That reverence did not survive the arrival of the Spanish. Conquistadors viewed local crops through the lens of European superiority. Quinoa was pagan, a symbol of indigenous identity, a reminder of a world they sought to erase. Wherever possible, the Spanish discouraged its cultivation, introducing wheat and barley as replacements. White flour became the standard of civilization. Quinoa became a marker of backwardness. What had once been sacred was reduced to a lowly crop, cultivated only in isolated highland villages by farmers with no access to European staples. For hundreds of years, quinoa existed at the margins. It was considered the food of the poor, of those who could not afford imported or refined grains. Urban elites dismissed it as animal fodder, as coarse, bitter, and inferior. Eating quinoa marked one as subordinate, tied to subsistence, to survival rather than choice. It was a food for those who labored where the soil was thin and the climate harsh. Quinoa endured because necessity demanded it, not because it was sought after. Its identity as a peasant grain persisted until the modern era. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, global interest in nutrition, protein content, and gluten-free alternatives shifted perceptions. Health-conscious consumers in Europe and North America began demanding the very grain once suppressed and scorned. Quinoa's nutritional virtues, complete protein, fiber, and minerals, suddenly made it desirable. As supply met international demand, prices soared. The irony is sharp. The people who had cultivated quinoa for centuries, sustaining themselves through generations of marginal land and colonial oppression, could no longer afford it. A crop that had symbolized poverty and survival became a marker of wealth and lifestyle. Today, quinoa commands top dollar in organic markets, served in cafes, packaged in pristine bags with health claims and certifications. What was once a seed of necessity is now a superfood for the privileged. Quinoa's story is not about innovation or culinary evolution. It is about social inversion. The food of peasants became the food of elites, not because it changed, but because the world around it did. What fed the oppressed now nourishes the wealthy, a stark reminder that value is as much cultural as it is nutritional. The sacred grain of the Andes, once suppressed and marginalized, now sits on plates far removed from the mountains that birthed it. Bird's nest. Bird's nest soup was never intended to impress. It was intended to sustain. Long before it graced gilded tables or appeared in luxury menus across Asia, the nests of the swiftlet were a practical resource. Coastal villagers in Southeast Asia discovered that these fragile structures, built entirely from the solidified saliva of the birds, contained surprisingly high levels of protein and bioactive compounds. In regions where arable land was scarce and agriculture offered little yield, these nests were a vital supplement. They were collected by poor families living near the cliffs and caves where the birds nested, providing a source of nutrition that required no planting, no tending, and no cost beyond effort and risk. Harvesting was arduous. Swiftlets built their nests in remote caves, clinging to vertical walls high above jagged floors. Villagers scaled these cliffs using bamboo ladders or improvised scaffolding, balancing on ledges where a single misstep could prove fatal. The nests were fragile, requiring careful extraction to avoid breakage. Yet for the local populations, the danger was secondary to the value of the find. The nests were not delicacies. They were food and medicine combined, used to treat respiratory complaints, coughs, and skin ailments. The soup that later became synonymous with wealth was originally a functional, utilitarian preparation, consumed quietly in village homes, far from public attention or prestige. For generations, bird's nest soup existed without fanfare. It was inexpensive in its social context because labor, while dangerous, was borne by those with few alternatives. The nests were part of daily life, a supplement to meager diets, a source of protein for children and the infirm. Its perceived value lay in utility, not status. The transformation began when knowledge of the nests reached the imperial courts of China. The product that once nourished villagers became a symbol of refinement and longevity. Elite consumers imbued the nests with mystical properties, believing they could promote beauty, enhance vitality, and extend life itself. The soup moved from kitchens of necessity to the tables of the wealthy, and with that shift came a dramatic revaluation. What had once been abundant in local caves became rare, dangerous, and precious. Over time, scarcity, risk, and labor became intertwined with prestige. The high price was justified not merely by flavor, but by danger and exclusivity. Modern demand has elevated birds' nest soup into the so-called caviar of the East. Entire industries now specialize in cultivating swiftlets in controlled environments to meet global demand. Yet the original context, wild nests collected by impoverished villagers, consumed as basic nutrition and medicine, is almost entirely forgotten. Bird's nest soup illustrates the inversion of social value. What was once a humble, functional food for survival is now a multi-billion-dollar luxury commodity. The biology of the swiftlet did not change. The labor required to gather the nests did not change. What changed was who consumed it, and what society decided that consumption was worth. Today's price tag is a marker of status, but its origins remain rooted in the ingenuity and risk of the poor, who first recognized the utility of a bird's fragile creation. Lobster Rise. Lobster was once the food of the desperate. Long before it appeared on gleaming silver platters or in butter-drizzled gourmet dishes, lobster was an abundant nuisance. In colonial New England, storms frequently washed the crustaceans ashore in staggering piles, sometimes 2 feet high. To the settlers, they were not a delicacy. They were pests, sea insects fit only for those with no other options. Families scraping by on meager rations considered lobster a last resort, a cheap protein for servants, prisoners, and the impoverished. Shells scattered in yards were a visible mark of poverty, a daily reminder of economic failure. The stigma extended beyond mere social disdain. Lobster was so lowly that it was commonly used as fertilizer for fields or as bait to catch more desirable fish. Its flesh was rarely appreciated for flavor. It was valued only for its abundance. In some Massachusetts towns, laws were enacted to limit how often prisoners could be fed lobster, deeming repeated servings cruel and unusual punishment. Servant contracts even specified that lobster could be served no more than 2 or 3 times per week. To eat lobster was to announce one's place at the very bottom of the social ladder. This perception persisted well into the 19th century, cementing lobster's identity as a food of the oppressed. It was cheap, plentiful, and unwanted. Its consumption carried no dignity. The laborious task of cooking it, boiling a live creature over a fire, did little to elevate it. It remained a meal born of necessity, not choice. Lobster, in its original context, was survival, not sophistication. The transformation began with technology and geography. The expansion of the railway network allowed fresh seafood to travel inland for the first time. People living far from the coast encountered lobster not as an abundant nuisance, but as a novelty. It was exotic, unfamiliar, and, crucially, portable. Entrepreneurs recognized an opportunity. Canning preserved the meat for transport, creating demand among consumers who had never seen lobster in its natural habitat and who associated it with curiosity rather than poverty. Chefs soon discovered that presentation and preparation could erase the animal's ignoble past. When drenched in butter, paired with white tablecloths, and served in refined restaurants, lobster became luxurious. Its flavor, once ignored or reviled, was suddenly celebrated. Social perception shifted entirely. By the late 19th century, coastal lobster populations began to dwindle due to overfishing, and the crustacean had firmly shed its identity as prison rations or servant fare. Today, lobster commands high prices at restaurants around the world. Its image as a premium, coastal delicacy masks centuries of lowly consumption. What was once a marker of poverty is now a symbol of status and indulgence. The sea insect that washed up in piles on the New England shore has become a defining icon of culinary wealth, a transformation driven not by the animal itself, but by geography, technology, and social imagination. The lobster's rise is a story of perception overturned, of necessity rewritten as luxury. Caviar Commonplace. Caviar was never always a symbol of wealth. Once, it was nourishment for the laboring poor. Long before it graced crystal spoons and gilded trays, sturgeon thrived in rivers across Russia and Europe, producing vast quantities of eggs that carried little social weight. These eggs, the very roe now celebrated as luxury, were originally considered a byproduct of fishing, an incidental harvest from fish caught for meat. Laborers, dockhands, and rural families quickly discovered their value not as delicacies, but as sustenance. The eggs were high in calories and protein, easy to salt and store for short periods, and could be spread over coarse black bread to create a filling, cheap meal. For those with little else to eat, caviar was survival, not indulgence. Its abundance made it nearly invisible in terms of social prestige. In 19th century Russia, caviar was sold by the bucket. There were no labels, no presentation, no refinement. It was simply food that existed in enormous quantity, cheap, readily accessible, and eaten daily by those who worked rivers, docks, and fishing boats. In the United States, the story was similar. Saloons, precursors to modern bars, served salted caviar freely, much like peanuts or pretzels are served today. The goal was not culinary enjoyment, but practicality. The salty snack encouraged patrons to drink more, keeping them in place and boosting sales. Massive quantities were harvested from rivers like the Delaware, yet the eggs were considered nothing special. Even the flavor, briny and intense, was tolerated out of necessity rather than preference. There was no ceremony, no delicacy, and no association with refinement. Its consumption was defined by abundance, utility, and availability. Caviar's history, for centuries, was tied to survival, not status. The shift began with perception and scarcity. In Russia, tsars and nobility began incorporating caviar into state banquets, elevating it from humble fare to emblem of sophistication. European aristocrats followed, introducing preparation techniques, presentation, and ritual that transformed a simple salted egg into a symbol of refinement. Its edible abundance suddenly acquired social meaning. The same egg that once nourished laborers now distinguished elites from commoners. Environmental changes intensified the shift. Overfishing and pollution drastically reduced sturgeon populations worldwide. What had been plentiful and cheap became rare and highly sought after. Scarcity drove prices to astronomical levels. A food once given away freely in buckets was now sold by the ounce, valued for its rarity, texture, and flavor rather than necessity. Caviar's story illustrates the dramatic inversion of social value. Its biology did not change. Its preparation did not change. What changed was who consumed it, and under what circumstances. The eggs that once sustained the working poor are now an icon of wealth and indulgence, a luxury whose history is largely forgotten, buried beneath the allure of status and scarcity. Bouillabaisse Origins. Bouillabaisse was never created for luxury. It was created for survival. Long before it appeared on polished restaurant tables or inspired guidebook devotion, bouillabaisse existed on the beaches of Marseille as a practical solution to scarcity. Fishermen brought in daily catches, but only the freshest, largest fish commanded a market price. The leftovers, small, bony, spiny rockfish, were considered unsellable. Rather than discard them, laborers tossed these scraps into a pot of seawater, added garlic, fennel, and whatever herbs were on hand, and boiled them into a hearty stew. The goal was nourishment, not artistry. Every spoonful was a necessity, consumed by tired hands and hungry mouths after long hours at sea. The original bouillabaisse was rough and rustic. There was no fixed recipe, no careful plating, no luxurious ingredients. Bones dominated the dish, making it a messy endeavor to eat, but this did not matter to the fishermen who relied on it to sustain themselves. Its very composition reflected economy and ingenuity. Nothing was wasted. Everything edible was incorporated. Each day's stew was defined by what remained, a culinary patchwork dictated by circumstance rather than taste. Bouillabaisse, in its earliest form, was a testament to working-class resilience, a gritty, functional food born from necessity. For centuries, the dish remained a local survival food. Visitors to Marseille would occasionally witness the practice, but it held no appeal beyond those who understood the life of the sea. It was humble, even unappealing by the standards of wealthier classes. The market scraps that defined the stew reinforced its lowly status. Eating bouillabaisse meant embracing the resourcefulness of laborers, not the sophistication of chefs. The transformation began in the 19th century, as tourism and rising interest in regional cuisine introduced outsiders to Marseille's culinary traditions. Chefs saw potential in the humble fisherman's stew. They refined the ingredients, adding saffron to elevate color and aroma, separating the broth from the fish to create courses that felt deliberate rather than incidental, and establishing a sense of ceremony around its consumption. What was once dictated by leftovers became codified by preference. Today, bouillabaisse is celebrated as a culinary icon. The dish has a strict charter defining which fish and preparation methods are authentic. A bowl in Marseille can cost $70 or more, a stark contrast to its origins as a stew of scraps consumed for immediate survival. Its rise from gritty necessity to gastronomic prestige illustrates the inversion of social and economic value, showing how perception, scarcity, and presentation can elevate a humble laborer's meal into a symbol of refinement. Bouillabaisse's history reminds us that the foundation of luxury often rests upon the discarded and overlooked. What nourished the working poor now commands admiration and expense, a dish whose elevated status obscures the rugged reality of its origins on the shores of Marseille.